Welcome to Mr. Horror. Today, we have 4 spine-chilling true stories about creepy neighbors that will leave you feeling uneasy. So, grab a blanket, turn off the lights, and prepare to be scared. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more terrifying tales in the future, and don't forget to turn on your notifications to be the first to see our new videos. Let's get started. My name is Sarah, and I recently moved into a new apartment building in a quiet neighborhood. At first, everything seemed fine. The rent was affordable, the building was well maintained, and my neighbors seemed friendly enough. But as the days went by, I started to notice some strange things happening. It started with small things, like hearing strange noises in the middle of the night. At first, I brushed it off as the building settling or the sound of the wind, but then I started to notice that the noises were coming from my neighbor's apartment. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard when the noises continued every night. I could hear footsteps, shuffling, and even the sound of someone whispering. It was creepy, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But then things got even weirder. I started to notice that my neighbors would stare at me whenever I walked by their apartment. They would stand in their doorway, just watching me with blank expressions on their faces. It was unsettling, to say the least. One day, I tried to introduce myself to them, but they didn't say much in return. They just stared at me with those blank expressions, and I couldn't help but feel like they were hiding something. As the days went by, I became more and more uneasy. I started to avoid leaving my apartment as much as possible, just to avoid encountering my creepy neighbors. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in that building. The days turned into weeks, and Sarah's unease only grew. Her neighbor's behavior had become increasingly strange, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One night, Sarah was awoken by the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom window. She sat up in bed and listened, her heart racing. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was purposefully trying to scare her. Sarah mustered up the courage to look out the window, but she saw nothing. She tried to calm herself down, telling herself that it was just her imagination, but the feeling of dread wouldn't go away. The next day, Sarah noticed that her neighbors had put up a new fence around their property. It was tall and imposing, and it completely blocked her view of their yard. She couldn't help but wonder what they were trying to hide. That same day, Sarah received a strange package in the mail. It was a small, wooden box wrapped in black paper. There was no return address and no note inside. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it was from her neighbors, but she didn't know what to make of it. As the weeks went by, Sarah began to feel like she was being watched. She would catch glimpses of her neighbors through their windows, always staring back at her with blank expressions. It was as if they were waiting for something. One evening, Sarah was sitting in her living room, reading a book, when she heard a knock at her door. She hesitated for a moment, but then got up to answer it. Standing on her porch was a man she had never seen before. He was tall and thin, with dark, greasy hair and a wide smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his voice cold and calculated. "I'm your new neighbor." Sarah's heart sank as she looked at the man standing on her porch. She knew that he wasn't her new neighbor, but she didn't know what to do. The man's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "May I come in?" he asked. Sarah shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I don't think that's a good idea." The man's expression darkened, and he took a step closer to Sarah. "I insist," he said, his voice becoming more aggressive. Sarah stepped back, trying to put some distance between them, but the man was too fast. He pushed his way into her house, knocking Sarah to the ground. Sarah scrambled to her feet and ran towards the front door, but the man was too quick. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight and unyielding. Sarah fought back with all her might, but the man was too strong. He dragged her back into the living room, throwing her onto the couch. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," he spat, his eyes burning with fury. "You should have stayed out of our business." Sarah knew that she was in grave danger. She looked around the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. But before she could act, there was a loud pounding at the door. "Police, open up," a voice shouted. The man's grip loosened, and Sarah took the opportunity to run towards the door. She flung it open, revealing a group of police officers, their guns drawn. The man was arrested, and Sarah never saw him or her neighbors again. But the experience left a lasting impression on her. She never forgot the feeling of being watched, and she never trusted her neighbors again. Maggie had just moved into her new apartment, excited to start her new life in a new city. Her neighbors seemed friendly enough, offering to help her with her boxes and introducing themselves with warm smiles. But as time went on, Maggie began to realize that there was something off about her new neighbors. It started with the strange smells coming from the apartment next door. They were pungent and sickly sweet, and they lingered in the hallway long after her neighbors had gone inside. Maggie tried to ignore it, telling herself that they must be cooking something unusual, but the smell only grew stronger. One night, Maggie was awoken by the sound of someone whispering outside her bedroom window. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened carefully. The whispers continued, low and guttural, and Maggie could hear the sound of scraping against the glass. She tried to tell herself that it was just the wind, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. The next morning, Maggie noticed that her neighbors had covered their windows with heavy curtains. She couldn't help but wonder what they were trying to hide. As the days went on, Maggie began to notice other strange things happening. She would hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway late at night, even when her neighbors should have been asleep. And when she would leave her apartment in the morning, she would often find strange markings etched into her door. Maggie started to feel like she was living in a horror movie, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her neighbors were watching her every move. She began to feel like she was losing her mind, and she didn't know who to turn to for help. One day, Maggie decided to confront her neighbors about the strange happenings. She knocked on their door, but no one answered. She tried again the next day, but still no one came to the door. Maggie's unease turned into fear when she heard loud banging coming from her neighbor's apartment. It sounded like someone was trying to break down the door. She called the police, but when they arrived, her neighbors denied that anything was wrong and insisted that they were just having a loud argument. After that incident, Maggie felt like she was living in a constant state of terror. She installed locks on her windows and doors and stayed up late at night, watching for any signs of her neighbor's strange behavior. One night, Maggie woke up to the sound of someone pounding on her door. She cautiously opened it, and to her horror, she found her neighbors standing on the other side. Their eyes were wild and unfocused, and they were covered in blood. Maggie screamed and slammed the door shut, locking it as quickly as she could. She could hear her neighbors pounding on the door, trying to break it down. She called the police again, but when they arrived, her neighbors were gone. From that day on, Maggie never felt safe in her own home. She eventually moved out, unable to shake the feeling that her neighbors were still watching her, even from a distance. The experience left Maggie with deep emotional scars and a lingering fear of strangers. She tried to move on with her life, but the memory of her creepy neighbors haunted her. Maggie couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if she hadn't been able to lock the door in time. Years later, Maggie read a news article about a couple who had been arrested for a string of brutal murders. The couple lived in an apartment complex just a few blocks away from where Maggie used to live. When she saw their photos, Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. They were her old neighbors. The revelation sent Maggie spiraling into a deep depression. She realized that her fears had been justified all along and that she had been living next door to dangerous criminals. It was a harsh lesson, but it taught her to trust her instincts and always be cautious of those around her. Emily had always heard stories about creepy neighbors, but she never thought she would end up living next to one. She had just moved into a new apartment, excited to start a new chapter in her life. Her neighbors seemed normal enough at first, but things quickly took a turn for the worse. It started with the strange noises coming from the apartment next door. Emily would hear banging, crashing, and even muffled screams coming from the other side of the wall. She tried to ignore it, but the noises only grew louder and more frequent. One night, Emily was woken up by a loud thud. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened carefully. The thuds continued, and she could hear the sound of someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Emily was terrified, but she knew she had to investigate. She cautiously made her way to her front door and pressed her ear against it. The noises were definitely coming from her neighbor's apartment, but she couldn't make out what was happening. She debated whether to call the police, but she didn't want to overreact. Maybe her neighbors were just moving furniture or something. The next day, Emily ran into her neighbor in the hallway. He was a tall, lanky man with wild hair and a strange glint in his eye. He smiled at her, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. It was then that Emily realized that there was something seriously wrong with her neighbor. As the days went by, Emily became increasingly uneasy around her neighbor. He would stare at her for uncomfortably long periods of time and mutter to himself incoherently whenever she passed by. She could feel his gaze following her every move, even when she was inside her own apartment. Emily tried to avoid her neighbor as much as possible, but one day she found herself in the elevator with him. The doors closed, and her neighbor turned to her, his eyes wide and frantic. "You're in danger," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily was stunned. "What do you mean?" she asked, her heart racing. "My wife is going to kill me," he said, his eyes darting around the small space. "And she's going to kill you too." Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. She tried to back away, but the elevator was too small. She was trapped with her neighbor, who was clearly unstable and possibly dangerous. The seconds ticked by like hours as Emily waited for the elevator to reach her floor. When the doors finally opened, Emily practically ran out of the elevator and into her apartment. She called the police immediately, and when they arrived, they found her neighbor barricaded inside his apartment, muttering to himself and clutching a kitchen knife. Emily was relieved that she had trusted her instincts and reached out for help, but she knew that she would never feel truly safe in her apartment again. Emily moved out of the apartment complex soon after the incident. She couldn't bear the thought of living next to someone as dangerous and unpredictable as her former neighbor. She also didn't want to take any chances with her safety. The incident had left her traumatized, and she had trouble sleeping at night. Even though Emily had left the complex, she still couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She would look over her shoulder frequently, and every sound made her jump. It took her a while to regain her sense of security, but eventually she did. Emily learned a valuable lesson from her experience. She realized that she should trust her instincts and never ignore her gut feelings. She also learned that she couldn't let fear control her life. Although she would never forget what happened, she refused to let it define her future. Emily moved on, stronger and wiser from the experience. David was excited to move into his new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but his excitement quickly turned to fear when he met his new neighbor, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson was a tall, thin man with wild hair and an unsettling grin. He would often stare at David through the window, even when he was inside his own home. David tried to be friendly to Mr. Johnson, but he always seemed distant and uninterested in conversation. David started to notice strange things happening around his house, like his lawn ornaments being moved around or his mail disappearing. He had a feeling that Mr. Johnson was behind it, but he couldn't prove anything. One day, David was out in his yard when he heard a loud crash from next door. He peeked over the fence and saw Mr. Johnson smashing his own car with a baseball bat. David was shocked and scared, and he didn't know what to do. He knew he had to be careful around his unpredictable neighbor. As the weeks went by, David became more and more paranoid about Mr. Johnson. He would see him lurking around outside at odd hours of the night, and he could hear him muttering to himself through the thin walls of their houses. David tried to stay out of Mr. Johnson's way as much as possible, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his neighbor was up to something. One night, David woke up to the sound of footsteps outside his bedroom window. He got out of bed and peered outside and saw Mr. Johnson standing outside, staring up at him with that unsettling grin on his face. David felt a chill run down his spine and quickly closed his blinds. The next day, David decided to confront Mr. Johnson about his behavior, but when he knocked on his neighbor's door, no one answered. He tried again later that day, but still no response. David knew that something wasn't right, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in danger. Over the next few weeks, David tried to avoid Mr. Johnson as much as possible, but one day, he came home to find his front door kicked in and his house ransacked. He knew it was Mr. Johnson. The police were called and Mr. Johnson was arrested, but David never felt completely safe in his own home again. He moved out soon after and never spoke to Mr. Johnson again. David realized too late that he should have trusted his instincts and kept his distance from his creepy neighbor. Thank you for joining us on this spine-chilling journey through 4 true horror stories. From haunted apartments to creepy neighbors, we hope these tales have sent shivers down your spine. If you enjoyed these stories, be sure to give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. By doing so, you'll be the first to know when we release new videos. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out on any of our terrifying content. Once again, thank you for watching, and we look forward to sharing more hair-raising tales with you in the future.